Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, the British served as the fundamental linchpin which not only held together but built, financed, and motivated coalitions against Napoleon's France. Without the supporting role of Britain, it's very possible Napoleon could have maintained dominance over the vastness of Europe, even continuing to exert dominance over Russia so long as it didn't require a direct invasion in the dead of winter. Unfortunately for France, Britain does exist. Napoleon recognized the significant threat it posed to his new order, and thus conceived of three major plots to neutralize Britain, allowing him to usher in his Continental dynasty. The first of these plots was, of course, invasion. This, however, collided with the fact that France could not overpower the British Navy, and even if they could, would need to overcome a fortified coastline before they could reach the vulnerable mainland. This led to considerations of anything from air balloon deployment to tunneling under the English Channel before invasion was ultimately scrapped as an idea. Plan B was an attempt at alliance, to be achieved through a mutual occupation of Egypt or Iberia in order to maintain British presence in the Mediterranean as a show of good faith. However, this too turned up empty. But finally came what would become known as the Continental System, a continent-wide trade policy bent on screwing Britain over. Kind of like that thing we've got going on now. Jokes aside, the Continental System was a continent-wide mass embargo of Britain. Every state made a client of or compliant to France would abstain from any and all trade with the island empire. Being that Britain was cut off from the mainland and thus highly dependent upon trade, it was believed that this system would starve Britain into submission, both economically and literally, allowing it to be toppled or forced into surrender in due time, giving Napoleon full reign to exert his influence across Europe as a universal monarch, installing his familial dynasty, doing away with antiquated hierarchies, and creating a new progressive meritocratic order, except the Continental System failed. A lack of loyalty to Napoleon from conquered states, Britain's ability to conduct trade with its colonies, smuggling conducted all across Europe, British access to ports in Iberia, and an industrial era which demanded more resources than ever before, all contributed to a rapid loss of faith in Napoleon's system, if even that faith had existed at all. Thus, the Continental Bloc fractured and eventually led Napoleon to invade Russia in an attempt to coax continued compliance, only to return empty-handed while the conflict in Iberia worsened, allowing his conquered domains to rise up against him, and ultimately oust him from power. But what if things had gone differently? As previously stated, the Continental System essentially backfired upon Napoleon, dealing to him and his faction the same damage he had hoped to deal onto Britain. The largest factor which played into this was the great advantage the British already held in both industrialization and vastness of land and resources to draw upon, thanks to their unmatched colonial empire. Yes, Britain was but a small island while Europe was a great landmass, but with the British holding the reins of the greatest navy at the time, what were spread out overseas possessions could essentially serve the same purpose as Napoleon's client states. Britain as a united force was in essence a second continent-sized power, and not just a mere island. A power capable of outproducing the French, thanks to Britain's now exclusive technological advancement and head start in the Industrial Revolution. In the end, it's just no contest. Britain, even without the whole of Europe, could still have a great deal of momentum behind it, while the rest of Europe, yet to fully industrialize, was beginning to slow down in absence of the production Britain contributed. Economic conditions became harder, and thus we saw the rise of disobedience, betrayal, and abandonment across the French faction. In this alternate world, that never happens. A major problem, as many expected, was that even if the embargo greatly impacted Britain, it would still come at a significant cost to the rest of Europe. Napoleon, in trying to economically hold Britain hostage, only did so to the rest of Europe. Had he instead offered a solution to alleviate some of the economic strain along with this policy, he may well could have averted the backlash that soon followed. Let's propose that in this alternate timeline, Napoleon's Continental System serves as not only a blockade policy, but a plan for European trade and sustainability, without Britain. If France was to be the new axis around which Europe would spin, then France would need to not only set an example, but put effective rule into practice across the continent for the betterment of all. That means building industry, infrastructure, spreading education, and creating a self-sufficient economic ecosystem that doesn't crumble without the authority of the British. Napoleon would in essence be laying the groundwork for a proto-European Union, or perhaps more accurate a comparison, triggering a Meiji Restoration for a new European empire. The promise of and early foundations of pan-European industrializing, as well as mutual trade protection, would satiate the fence-sitting client states into enduring initial economic hardships for the sake of achieving something much greater. The war must no longer be felt like Napoleon's own crusade, but a campaign against British domination on the part of Europe as a whole. It's not about putting France in charge, it's about taking Britain off of the throne. If Napoleon could successfully spin it this way, he could more easily get these factions on his side. What results is that smuggling from the Netherlands and Scandinavia drops to negligible levels, Russia remains in the bloc, and Napoleon is thus able to focus all military efforts on Iberia, where, for the sake of this scenario, we'll suggest Napoleon manages to push into and conquer Portugal, forcing the old government into exile in Brazil. It'd also be possible for the US to indirectly support France, as during this period the US attempted to maintain neutrality and conduct trade with both France and Britain, of course leading to hostilities with both. However, American tensions already existed with Britain on account of recent capturing of American sailors to serve in the British Army. Additionally came Macon Bill No. 2, a bill in which the US vowed to cease trade with one of the rival nations if the other vowed to stop attacking American vessels, of course hoping that both Britain and France would agree, allowing for a neutral trade to continue. But only France did, and Britain, offended by this proposition, threatened forceful action against both. So you'd think that'd be pretty clear-cut, but Napoleon soon made it clear that he had no intention of honoring his promise, and thus so did the exclusive French-American trade agreement cease to exist before conflicts finally broke out between the US and Britain in the War of 1812. Regardless, American trade would be cut off once the war broke out, and even had Napoleon maintained the US trade alliance, it would very likely revert to neutrality soon after. With Iberia secured and mainland Europe refusing cooperation with Britain, the island empire is no longer able to regain a foothold on the continent, leaving it much like Cuba during the Cold War. That is, if Cuba had the world's most formidable navy and a massive colonial empire to draw upon. But you get the idea. Locally, it's very isolated, ostracized, and very much not wanted. Unavoidably, this embargo would stifle global innovation and commerce, but technology does still progress at a fair pace. As the years wear on, the two still excel in various fields thanks to a variety of inventions. The mainlanders developing superior rifles and explosives as they had in our world, as well as electric motors, pilotable airships, and more effective printing technologies, while the British developed better industrial machines, tunneling technologies, and a lot of stuff to do with magnetism that could open the door for some sci-fi steampunky developments. But let's put that aside. These innovations are likely to make the mainlanders superior land and air soldiers, while the British become more proficient at mass-producing, allowing them to further develop their colonies into identical extensions of Britain, and begin work on extensive transit systems to better connect the colonies and the settlements across those colonies, potentially creating a transcontinental rail line in Canada, much like the US would. Canada would become the primary focus of the British Empire, being its closest colony and friendliest domain, allowing it to exert influence and then seize Scandinavian-controlled colonies that are sparsely occupied in order to give it a safe domain in the North Atlantic. The mainlanders, in lieu of overseas possessions and being consistently harassed by British vessels at sea, would need to find a more regular trade partner, one who might help them in securing the Mediterranean from British influence. I'm of course referring to the Ottoman Empire, a state who has held a historical special relationship with France, though briefly soured by Napoleon upon his refusal to return Romanian and Moldovan territories he had previously promised. Assuming Napoleon secures the continent in this timeline and Russia remains with him instead of Britain, the Turks may be more patient as Napoleon finds them necessary to his plans and worth the sacrifice of these petty territories. And if not, well, Napoleon's on a bit of a time limit anyway, so if not him, then perhaps his more passive brother would be more inclined to appeasing the Ottomans. With the mainland powers confined to Europe and the Mediterranean, the former colonies would come under occupation by Britain, the British doing so in compensation for the economic opportunities lost due to Napoleon's continental system. This would inadvertently drive the British to become more present and domineering in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, at a time when the US would have begun testing the waters of overseas expansion, potentially leaving the two butting heads over Pacific Islands and influence in Japan. As for the domestic policy of Europe, we'd see the integration of the Napoleonic Code state by state, give or take some modifications here and there as in our world, with the last of these states likely to be Russia, which Napoleon regarded as socially stubborn and backwards, a political inversion of the Enlightened system he'd hoped to achieve. Of course, Napoleon would be gone by this point, but assuming his policies and legacy left significant enough an impression on Europe to reassure the population of his plan, those who would seek to continue it would exist and keep the gears of the Napoleonic machine moving. What that means is the gradual abolition of hereditary nobility to be replaced by celebrity of merit, essentially meaning that one doesn't earn status through birth, but only through personal achievement. We'd see the enforcing of equality of law and freedom to all men across Europe, and a right to self-rule free of subjugation to foreign powers, meaning the diverse and Germanocentric Austrian Empire would likely be broken up with land given to the Hungarians and the South Slavs, the Ottomans too being cajoled to grant more autonomy to Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania. What we're left with is a potentially century long political and social divide between the mainland Europeans and the British. As time went on for the mainlanders, financial and resource stressors would be alleviated by innovations and cooperation, the population growing ever more capable of defending the continent as not only a union, but as a singular force. All the while, Britain becomes content to dominate the seas and spread its culture abroad, regaining ground in the New World, while it's free, if not encouraged, to pursue colonization of new resource-rich lands in Asia, while attempting to make of China a new trade partner, perhaps to an overbearing degree. While in this timeline it's possible the scramble for Africa may never happen simply because the German empire as we know it would never come to be, as well as the rest of the European empires, given the rate at which Britain would continue expanding, and the likely French desire to acquire some colonial territories of its own, we could see the beginnings of a north-south divide over claims to the African continent, and that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.